Thank you for joining us today on the Old Black Book television program. I am Christopher Horn, pastor of the West Milton Baptist Church. We bring you this program with the goal of lifting up Christ, proclaiming the gospel, and encouraging the saved. We invite you to attend our services or visit us on the web at www.wmbchurch.com. We hope that you enjoy today's edition of the Old Black
Bibles tonight to the Gospel of Mark, chapter number 9. The Gospel of Mark, chapter number 9. This morning we were blessed of the Lord to be able to go up the mountain with Christ. He separated 3 of His disciples, what we often refer to as His inner circle, and He took them up the mountain, what we refer to now as the mountain of Transfiguration. And on this journey, on this trek, we discovered that after He had, in the previous chapter, 6 days earlier, taught them about what it meant to be a disciple of Christ, that it meant we were to deny ourselves, take up our cross, to follow Christ. He then takes these disciples on this journey, on this trek up the mountain, and really, as we noticed this morning, it typifies what it takes to be a disciple. That journey up that mountain typifies what it is to be a disciple, being or giving everything we have on that journey, putting it all in, so to speak. And at the end of that journey, there was a great reward for these that partook, because they were able to see Christ in a great, in a glorious way. They were exposed to the brightness of His glory, to the awesomeness of His power, in a way that not many have ever been or seen. And seeing Christ in that way was important for them. For the time to come in their life very soon was going to be different than it had been the last 2 years. Things were going to become very confrontational in the last months of the ministry of Christ. He had already begun speaking to them about how that He was going to Jerusalem, He was going to die. Up on the top of this mountain, we found from Luke's account that Moses and Elijah, what were they talking about? They were talking about the fact that Christ was going to Jerusalem and He was going to die. And so this time that they were able to spend on the mountain, this great experience, was in preparation for what was to come and for their lives as disciples of Christ. Showed us also there was a great reward for those that are willing to be true disciples of Christ. It is always worth it. It is always what we should do. It's always what we should be about. We need to get an understanding, a better view of Christ. To do that, we've got to deny, take up, and follow. Those are the things we have to do. The view from the top of the mountain was much different than below. And we all tonight have a view of Christ. We all have some kind of understanding that God has allowed us to have. That understanding is imperfect because of our own sin and our depravity, our limitations. But it's also imperfect because we have, to some degree, allowed religion or the world to shape that view in some way. And so as they went up the mountain, they saw Christ transfigured before them, and He became something different before, or to them, than He was before. And that's what we need as well. He needs to be transfigured in our minds from what we think He is to what more like what He really is. He needs to be transformed from the common appearance to us of what Christ is, what we're comfortable with. We need to go to this place and have Christ transformed before our eyes and see and gain a better perspective on Jesus Christ. And it takes going up the mountain of discipleship to do that. We can't do that where we are with just a little bit of a commitment, with just a little bit of zeal. We can't see the real Christ. And oh, how we need to get that picture of Christ, an understanding of Christ, to be more glorious, more powerful, more righteous than we currently have. That's what we need. It's what we need. And so as they were up the mountain, it was a glorious experience, we know. We remarked this morning about how Peter, while he was on top of the mountain, he was awestruck. He made the statement, "It is good for us to be here," and it was because of the glory and the reward and how they saw Christ. And you know what? Peter wanted to stay. He said, "Let us build tabernacles, let's make tents and dwell here, and you dwell here, and let's just stay up here because it's good." It was impractical, and it was something we may kind of chuckle at, and certainly wasn't something the Lord granted to him. But it was a great desire of Peter's to continuously be in the glorified presence of Christ, to continuously be in the presence of His holiness at the center of His will, to continuously be at the top of that mountain, having given everything for Christ. That's where he wanted to be and where he wanted to stay. Read with me here in Mark chapter 9. In verse number 9, we find out that they couldn't stay there. They couldn't stay there. They had trekked up the mountain of discipleship to see the transfiguration of Christ. They wanted to stay. Then notice in verse 9, and as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen, till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. And they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising from the dead should mean. And they asked him, saying, what say the scribes, that Elias must first come? We'll get to that question more in just a minute. But we find here that even though they wanted to stay in the presence and the glory and the majesty of Christ, with His image being so bright, no fuller on earth could whiten it, as Luke says, glistering, as Mark says, and as white, as Matthew says, as the light. They wanted to remain in this place. They wanted to be blessed and to experience this far above, far removed from the troubles and the stresses and the cares of life, far removed from those things that we take and put before Christ, far removed from that which we let distract us to get off the path of following Christ, far removed from all of that. Peter said, let us stay here. But very soon thereafter, Christ transformed, if you will, back into His bodily appearance, His normal bodily appearance. And they were soon headed back down the mountain. For the time, they had to leave that behind. It was always stuck in their memory and their heart. Peter writes about it as we remarked this morning. It was something that really did have a great effect on their life. But you know what? They couldn't stay in that place forever. They had to come back down the mountain. They had to come back down around where there are things tempting us to go this way instead of follow Christ. There are things that are saying, no, put me before Christ. I want you to entertain yourself with me. I want you to be taking up your time with me. Had to come back down around those things. Far above the realities of life in the battlefield, they were blessed and enjoyed it. But they had to come back down to the battlefield of life. They had to get back in the trenches. And so they had to come back down the mountain. And on the downside of the mountain, they found that things were a whole lot different than they were at the top. A whole lot different than they were at the top. As we leave the mountain and come down, we find it to be different on this side of the mountain. As we approach the valley below, as we approach the battlefield that is there, that is our life. You know, this happened to them in a physical sense, as we have been noting, but you know what? This happens to us many times in life. Really, every Monday morning is coming back down from the mountain, or at least it should be. We should have prepared. We should have, denied ourselves, taken up our cross, followed Christ up the mountain on Sunday, had a vision and a view of Him unlike any other we could have seen anywhere else, being glorified before us, getting that understanding of who He is and enjoying being in His presence. Then you know what? Sunday night turns into Monday and you got to go back down the mountain. After that wonderful experience, you got to go back down the mountain. You got to go back to work and make sure you don't put work before Christ. You got to go back to family responsibilities and make sure you don't put wife and children before Christ. You got to go back to being in that normal mode of life between the mountaintop experiences of coming to church. And as we come back down, as we leave the fellowship, as we leave the confines of the Lord's church, as we leave conferences and revivals, as we leave seminars and other things we attend, at other times in our life too, we're coming back down the mountain. You experience this too on a daily basis as you go to the Lord in prayer in the morning. Maybe you have some time in the afternoon that you pray, some time in the evening, and you go to that mountain, if you will, and you commune with Christ, and then it's over. It's time to get back into the fight, back into the battle. You know, it may be your daily devotion time where you read your Bible and you pray and you strengthen yourself. There's a time you got to come back. Time you got to come back and sort of come back down the mountain. As they did, as they returned from the top of the mountain, as they came back down, they found themselves having to fight obstacles and overcome things that were thrown at them. Things they didn't experience necessarily on the top of the mountain in that moment. And these obstacles were real. They had to be overcome. They had been strengthened for the fight ahead. They had been strengthened for what was to come, for the experiences that they would have. But again, these were things that they had to overcome and they had to fight. And as I thought about this, it made me realize, if you think about our weekly coming into the Lord's house, climbing the mountain of discipleship, coming to the Lord's house, being revealed, a little bit more about Christ and who He is and all of that, it should teach us and it should impress upon us the importance of faithfulness to discipleship. We cannot be disciples of Christ without faithfulness. If we can go a month, if we can go a couple of weeks without reaching the top of that mountain and seeing Christ in a way we can't see Him at home or at work or on the golf course, if we can't do that, then we're really not, I believe, fulfilling what He says makes a true disciple. Because as we weekly, and even that Wednesday in between is so important, as we faithfully assemble, as we faithfully go up that mountain, having prepared and doing all those things, we find ourselves reaping the benefits of faithfulness. We find ourselves being able to fight the fight of faith in this life a whole lot easier. It's hard to fight the fight of faith without faithfulness. We need to be concerned about that today. We need to see that benefit of continually, constantly, and regularly being in the presence of Christ in the mountaintop, so to speak. So we need to be faithful so we can face the obstacles. So what obstacles did they face as they came down the mountain? We've identified a few we want to think about tonight from this passage especially, though of course Matthew and Luke also give us much detail. First of all, in verse number 10, I want you to see that as they began to come down the mountain, they faced questions. They faced questions. Notice here in verse 10, and they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising from the dead should mean. Now we have also remarked about how there's been a shift in the ministry of Christ. Before this point, He had mentioned, of course, His death, burial, and resurrection in type. He had shown it in miracle and shadow. He had mentioned it occasionally. But now, before He said, this is how you be my disciple, He first said, I'm going to die in Jerusalem, be buried, and rise again. They go up to the top of the mountain, and you know what? While they're, if we can use this terminology, while they're at church seeing Christ, they hear Moses and Elijah, God's spokesman, saying, Christ is going to Jerusalem and He's going to die. And then on the backside of the mountain, as they're coming back down to the battlefield and regular life, you know what? They hear from Christ again. He says, don't tell anything about what you've seen until I'm risen from the dead. He's just beginning to really lay it on them, something they yet don't understand. And so as they come down the mountain, and as He says this to them once again, the question arises in their mind, what does that mean? What does that mean? When they were in the presence of Christ in His transfigured form, it seems like everything made sense to them. And I mean that in a spiritual sense. Certainly the physical was overwhelmed. The one account we read, I think it was in Luke this morning, where it talked about that they seemed like they were almost asleep because they were so overwhelmed physically to process what was going on. But spiritually, on top of that mountain, it made sense when Moses said, Christ is going to Jerusalem and He's going to die. I mean, that made sense because of where they were. Have you ever experienced that being in church? You hear something preached, you hear something covered, you hear verses expounded upon, and you know what? You get it. It makes sense. And you come back down the mountain on Monday morning, back to work, and somebody asks you a question, or you get to thinking about things, and, life invades, and you're like, man, I don't understand that. How does, you kind of begin to question. You have questions that are there that weren't there on the mountain. obstacles to face, things to overcome. That's again why the faithfulness is so important to this discipleship. Faithfulness is so important to making sure that we are what we need to be for Christ in this day that we live in right now. Don't worry about last year. Don't worry about 10 years ago. Worry about now. Being ready to face those questions because they're going to come from within. Notice that's where they come from here. It's not from an outside source. They'll get to that in a minute. But the question that arises is because of what Christ said. No longer made sense to their flesh, to their minds. They no longer could spiritually discern, what is he talking about? That he's going to die and that he's going to rise again. It would certainly make sense in time to come, but at this moment, they were struggling with it. They were struggling with making sense of that and trying to figure out exactly what it meant. As they had been bathed in the glory and the power of Christ at the top of the mountain, those things added up, those things make sense. But now they're struggling to comprehend. You know how that is an obstacle we face in life. The further we get away from the mountain, the further we get away from seeing Christ in that high and lifted up position, the more questions we ask of ourselves, the more confusion sometimes comes to our mind. And so that's why once we come down that mountain, we need to continue praying. We need to continue reading. We need to continue meeting with Christ in our devotional life and everything of the sort, having family devotions even, so that we can continue getting just back up a little bit to that mountain, having those things be made right in our mind once again. Because we will face the questions. They'll come from within. There'll be somewhat of confusion in our hearts and in our minds. And I tell you what, especially in this day, and we're going to see this in just a moment, the things that are unfolding before us and now as we speak, if we do not remain in that constant place of being on the mountain and being in touch with Christ, seeing Christ, we're going to find ourselves even confused. We're going to find ourselves chasing rabbits or spending time on things that aren't profitable. We're going to find ourselves doing those things. And so we need to be careful in this time. And here's a good example. Notice here in verse 11, the second thing. Not only did they face questions from within, but they faced religious opposition. Religious opposition. And that may be a little strong of a word for what's going on here, but it's what came to mind as I looked at this. Notice here in verse 11. They had another question for Christ, and they asked him, saying, what say the scribes? Why say the scribes that Elias must first come? And he answered and told them, Elias verily cometh first and restoreth all things. And how it is written of the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be set at naught. There it is again, I'm going to die. There's nothing you can do about it but be my disciple. Lay down your life like I will, follow me. And so they asked this question, and then in verse 13, but I say unto you that Elias is indeed come, and they have done unto him whatsoever they listed, as it is written of him. We notice also in verse 14, after they finished coming down the mountain, when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes reasoning with him. They faced religious opposition. The scribes, obviously, were part of the religious machine of the day. And the disciples, Peter, James, and John here, they had just seen Elijah. They had just seen him there beside Christ, talking to Christ, talking with Christ about his death, burial, and resurrection. And so coming down the mountain, they're remembering what the scribes said. The scribes said that Elijah must come. And indeed, they were looking for Elijah physically to come. And so they began to reason and began to think. And so they asked Christ, this is kind of a truth that they've been saying, this religion, if you will, has been putting forth. What about it? We've just seen Elijah. He's definitely not in bodily form. He vanished. You're here and you're going to Jerusalem to die. This doesn't make sense to us. There's a lot of things out in the world today that are founded on half-truths, that are founded on partial realities of Scripture, that will confuse us, and that will get us to the point that we don't know which end is up or which way to go if we allow ourselves to get out of contact with Christ. Here they do the right thing. When this arises, when this obstacle comes to their mind, they go to Christ. But understand it's an obstacle they had to face. on the mountain, it all made sense. There's Elijah, there's Moses, he's talking to Christ, Christ's going to die. They come down the mountain, they're reminded, well, the scribes said. The scribes say that he's going to die. Well, what we find, if you'll flip over to Matthew, as Christ even says there in Mark, that indeed they were right. Elijah must come. And so as they received that bit of information from Christ, perhaps they were spinning in their mind already, well, that doesn't make sense. He's up there, we're down here, you're headed to Jerusalem, you're going to die. And then he lays the truth of the matter on them. He says, indeed, Elijah has already came and restored all things. Matthew chapter 17. Verse 9, they come down the mountain. Verse 10, they ask this question. And then we see the answer of Christ. Verse 11, and Jesus answered and said unto them, Elias truly shall first come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elias has come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer of them. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. When you have a question, go to the source. Go to the source and find what the answer to that question is, because they're going to arise. Religion, out in the world today, they are going to make things seem as if they are true when obviously they're not. Maybe partially true, but not completely. And so what happens when we get caught up in that? What happens when tomorrow at work somebody asks you a question about what's to come and they've got a partial truth? Or they say, this is what this group says. What are you going to say? Question arises in your mind. Well, I know that's true. I know that has to happen, but yet I don't understand that. Where are you going to go? You better go to the source. Up on the mountain, they were bathed in the truth. They were bathed in the light. There was nothing up there really but truth for them to soak in. Down in the valley, or as they headed down the mountain, things were not quite as clear. And so this question had arisen, and they were instructed by Christ that he indeed has already came. And you know what they've done to him? They've killed him. He's restored all things. He set up the way for me to come. He made the mountains low. He made the valleys high. He made the path straight. I have come. I have begun my ministry. I am doing that which I have come to do. Things are restored. He's dead. And then he finishes that off by saying, and I'm going to die too. And he says they're going to do to me what they did to him. And so questions will arise from within, doubts, misunderstandings of our own, not being able to grasp things. We've got to overcome that. We've got to know where to go and what to do. Questions and opposition is going to arise from religion and from the world. We've got to know where to go and what to do. And we've got to be willing to do it. If you're not a committed disciple of Christ, you cannot do that. You'll be overran by these things, and you will be, like it says in Ephesians 4:14, like little children tossed to and fro, going back and forth with every wind of doctrine. Oh, how we need to grasp a hold of what it really means to be a disciple of Christ today. What it really means to give our life to Christ, to give every ounce of our energy to Christ. But then notice back in, let's say here in Matthew, if you're still there, Matthew 17. Notice here as they came down the mountain, not only the questions and the opposition of religion, but notice here that they also faced opposition from Satan. Opposition from Satan. Matthew chapter number 17. Notice here in verse number, let's back up here. This multitude had gathered. Notice here in verse number 15, a man came with his son and says, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is lunatic and sore vexed. For oft times he falleth into the fire, and oft into the water. And I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. So when you come down the mountain, you got to deal with the lunatics. And there's some truth there. I mean, it's a funny statement to make, but you know what? When you go to work on Monday morning, when you get back out into the world tomorrow, and you come down the mountain, you're going to deal with the lunatics. You're going to deal with those that are taken with the devil. You're going to deal with those that are a servant to the father of lies. Only a true disciple, a battle-hardened servant and soldier of Christ is going to be able to deal with that. We've got to be that for Christ if we are going to be used in this time. Read on here, verse 17. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you, and how long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. And Jesus rebuked the devil. He departed out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Oh, we find here that this child had within him a devil, a demonic spirit, one of Satan's emissaries, if not Satan himself. I mean, it says he rebuked the devil, right? And so whether it was just the emissary of Satan, Satan himself, the point is you come down the mountain and you face opposition from Satan. Truth is, we face it here too. We face it here too, and we've seen that very recently. And all the things going on, we see that, and we're going to continue to see that. And you know what? He knows his time is short. I don't know that he knows the day and the hour that Christ is specifically going to return. But he knows from that moment he's got 7 years. He knows that much. And he knows, like the rest of us, that coming of Christ could happen at any moment. He knows already his time's short. You know where his attention is going to be. His attention is going to be on those that are given to being true disciples. It's going to be in general focus more and more upon the true New Testament churches of the Lord. More and more. He's going to take his focus off the kingdom at large, because I don't want to make Satan sound like he's more powerful than God, but in a lot of ways he has crippled the kingdom at God's allowance. I mean, there was a time when there were a lot of different denominations, at least, that clung partly to the truth, partly to Scripture, and they stood. But now everybody's worshiping, and a lot of religions along with them, at the altar of homosexualism and abortion, and all of that kind of thing. And so religion in the kingdom is sort of crippled. God's allowed that to happen. Satan has done that. And so his focus is coming from the wide view of the kingdom down to the small view, if you will, of the church, the pillar and ground of the truth. And the more we're his disciple, the more we're given, he is going to attract our attention more and more. Last Sunday we used the example of the special forces of our military. The enemies of our country will focus on them because they know if they can take out a small platoon of 20 or 30 Navy SEALs or Delta Force or Rangers, they have killed an equivalent to maybe 1,000 regular soldiers because of their battle-tested, because of their skills, because of what they are able to do, their capabilities. And now Satan is drilling down, and he is coming to the point where almost all of his resources are going to be entirely focused on the Lord's church. So I say we need to be ready for this time. Coming down the mountain, this is what we face. This is what is there. Satan is there. As we get back into our normal lives, we need to watch out for him at the bottom of the mountain. He's there. This devil was there. Of course, the Pharisees were there too. Not only did the scribes, not only had they put the idea in the disciples' mind that Elijah had to come, but here they were, and they were kind of goading the disciples. Why can't you cast him out? What's going on here? What's the problem? And the disciples were very frustrated. I want you to see a fourth obstacle that we have to overcome at the bottom of that mountain, or on the backside of the hill, if you will. That obstacle is unbelief. We have to overcome the obstacle of unbelief. Notice here in verse number 19, after Christ cast out the devil, then came the disciples to Jesus apart and said, Why could not we cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, Because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if ye had faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. That's the kind of disciple that we need to be. It's the kind of disciple we need to be. But being that kind of disciple means we have a living, active, vibrant faith. We have a faith that is not dead, or a faith that is not inactive. We have a faith that will be prosperous, be going and be growing and be glowing for Christ. Always. He's not advocating little faith. Not a small grain, if you will. Many times he looked at his disciples and he said, "O ye of little faith." And that wasn't a good thing. So he's not telling them to have a little faith. He's saying, have faith. Have faith as a mustard seed that grows into the herb that even the birds can land upon, greater than any other herb. Have one of a vibrant, active that can be used by God. That's the kind of disciple we need to be. What's in the way of that is unbelief or a lack of faith. Lack of faith. And we need to make sure that we are believing. On top of the mountain, there's nothing but faith, being bathed in the glory of Christ. Nothing but faith. But as you come down the mountain, things don't look quite as crystal clear. You come down the mountain, you see a multitude assembled around the disciples. You see that they're not exactly, maybe there to laud your praises. And it is definitely a scene that unfolds here where they're trying to get something done. There's frustration. There's difficulty. I don't think we can do it. Obviously we can't. Christ comes along and does it, and he says, you've got unbelief in your heart. 2015, this September that we're serving the Lord in, it's not time for questioning and doubting. It's not time for unfaithfulness. It's not time for lacking of faith. It's hard to say this in the right way, but it's almost as if an understanding of this time, it's time for faith building to be done, and active people of God be demonstrating that faith out in the world today, serving God in this time that we're called to serve Him and live in. And so we need to be always on guard. Now, we can always be building our faith every day. But I kind of see our life, up to this time, and you can go back as far as you want in your life and make a point, if you will. For many of us, it's been this year when things have come to a realization for us at least, that before that we were preparing, and serving the Lord at the same time, and now it's just time to put everything in. It's time to serve the Lord, and we should have already been doing that, I understand. But it's not time to prepare anymore for, just what may be or all that. It's time to serve God, making those preparations now, and that will prepare us yet for the future. We don't have time for unbelief. It was found in the disciples here. Go back to Mark's account in Mark 9. But the dad of this boy, he understood that there was unbelief also in his heart, in his life. So coming down the backside of the mountain, we understand that we're going to face unbelief. Tomorrow, as you get up and look in the mirror, you may face a doubting question in your mind of whether or not the things that unfold will be to God's glory. You may face a question in your mind, am I going to be able to do it? You face a question in your mind, is God in control? These things happen. These doubts creep in. These unbelief gets placed in our heart. Mark chapter 9 again in verse number 23. Read verse 22. This is the man describing of his child, and oft times it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, I believe. Help thou my unbelief. He recognized within himself at the bottom of the mountain that there was some unbelief in his heart. The disciples had unbelief in their heart. I think you and I might be susceptible to having some unbelief in our heart at times. I know we are. I know I am. We need to guard against that, fight against that. We need to do everything we can to get to that mountain. Again, the work of discipleship, denying, taking up, following Christ, getting back to the top of that mountain, even if it's just for a few moments throughout the week until we get back to being there again and on the Lord's day. It ought to be a long time, a long week. We ought with everything. Tomorrow morning we ought to be thinking about what we learned today. We ought to also be looking forward to that mountain in the distance that's coming. And we ought to be climbing some smaller mountains along the way to get a better view of that mountain we're going to climb next Sunday to come into His presence again. We ought to long for it and look for it. But know that while we're here on the battlefield, we're going to face these kind of obstacles. They're here. They're real. And they're going to continue. Satan is real today, folks, more or as much as he's ever been, and he's as fierce as he's ever been. And if the restraint that the Lord was pleased to put upon him years ago is being lifted to some degree, and he's going to continue to fight, continue to do harm. And so we need to make sure we're dealing with these obstacles in life. And no doubt if you scour this passage, you can come up with some more things that are going on here that they had to do. Just as they deal with this man in this situation and the unbelief, very soon after that, as the disciples continue, you know what? They begin to fight. Covered that in the young Sunday school class I taught this morning. They begin to fight amongst themselves. I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. I was up on the mountain. I saw Christ, and I saw Elijah, and I saw Moses. Another one says, no, I was down here in the trenches, and I was trying to cast this demon out. I'm the greatest. That's something we got to fight too. As this time continues, we got to fight it. We need to realize that Christ is our head. He's the greatest. All the rest of us, it doesn't matter. We're just following Christ. It gives us all different places, responsibilities in life and all that, but it doesn't matter anyway. The pastor isn't greater than what you might identify as the least member. It isn't greater because of his position. He just has more responsibility. God's placed him there. And so we can't look around and say that. We can't argue amongst ourselves, but you know what? As we come down the mountain, that pride and all of that is there again. And so we need to fight against these. These are obstacles we overcome. What a glorious thing to consider being at the top of this mountain and having Christ transformed before our eyes. We've been able to climb such a mountain, or at least we had the opportunity to today. I pray that you have, as a true disciple of Christ, made the trek up that mountain, and today that Christ has been transformed before your eyes from maybe the world's view or maybe your own common view of Christ into this glorified, powerful, wonderful Savior as He is described here. But understand, in just a few minutes after we sing and after we dismiss in prayer and after we say our goodbyes, we're going back down the mountain. It's going to be a long few days before we get back up. During that time, practice practice denying yourself, practice taking up your cross, practice following Christ. We'll be able to get back up those mountains until we can come back together again. All we need to see this. Go back over this passage, read it, think about the transfiguration of Christ, and just be bathed in what it speaks to you about.
Thanks for joining us for today's edition of the Old Black Book. We pray that it has been a blessing to you today. We hope to see you sometime in our services, or that you will at least contact us. We pray that if but only for a moment today you will consider your need for Christ. He truly is the way, the truth, and the life. Join us again next week for another edition of the Old Black Book television program.